Thank you for joining us today. Today's session is for information and educational purposes only, and none of the session or content derived should be interpreted as legal advice. Your host for today from the Caribbean Regional Compliance Association is Glenna Smith. Glenna is one of the foremost experts in the area of anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism, as well as regulatory compliance. For over 30 years, she's been helping companies upgrade their programs to achieve better compliance, so she will really be able to take us deep into how criminals are taking advantage of the COVID-19 situation. And we'd like to welcome our two guest speakers today. Chanel Smith, who's an expert in risk management and compliance for financial institutions. Chanel brings a great deal of experience in developing policies and procedures, and so she will help us ensure through today's discussion that our corporate governance stays robust and responsive in the time of COVID-19. And Carrie Steinbauer, whose expertise is in U.S. economic sanctions, anti-corruption, anti-money laundering, and really has focused her career on advising clients to make sure they're always in compliance with U.S. sanctions and regulations. Carrie also has very specialized knowledge since her career actually began at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, and so we will hear from her what she expects in terms of sanctions during the COVID crisis. Well, now I'll turn it over to Glenna, your host from CRCA, so she can lead today's discussion. Glenna, your mic is unmuted.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you've got your cups of tea and coffee with you. We're just about to get started here. I just wanted to make a few opening remarks. So first of all, thank you for 2020. This is the Caribbean Regional Compliance Association's first webinar. We will be holding others this year. And I'd like to mention, for those of you that haven't already attended, we hold an annual compliance conference, typically in November of each year. And this year, we are scheduled to have one in beautiful Bermuda. Now, we are going ahead. We have our topics planned. We have our speakers planned. However, naturally, we're monitoring the current situation to see what will happen in terms of dates. But I do invite you to go ahead and have a look at our website. It is crcaconference.com. And you can look at the topics and the speakers and see what is coming next. Again, that's crcaconference.com. Also, in terms of news articles, cases, and so on, we have a Facebook page where we have a social media coordinator that posts a lot of events there, as well as updates of what will be happening with our conference. So please, I invite you to follow us on Facebook. And the Facebook page is Caribbean Regional Compliance Association : conference. Again, look there for updates and so on. So coming back to today, as we can see, if you're reading the news at all and paying attention to what's going on, especially from a compliance perspective, turmoil always presents opportunities. Not only does it present, in some cases, legitimate business opportunities, but it also presents opportunities for criminals and terrorist organizations. So we're going to dive in and explore this in more detail together today. And I'm very excited and very honored to have both Chanel and Carrie joining me today as we take you through all kinds of topics. So first, I'll let you know some of the topics we're going to be going through today. First, I'm going to take us through some current scams and fraud and see where there's a lot of exploitation right now. Carrie's going to take us through sanctions and what to expect during this crisis time. Chanel is going to take us through a really nice and important walkthrough of what you can do to manage your compliance program, your responsibilities, and your risks during the pandemic. We're going to look at transaction monitoring and where you need to make changes if you haven't already. We'll also discuss terrorism. Terrorism doesn't sleep. Terrorism is closer than you think. And we're going to look at where they, just like organized crime groups and criminals, are exploiting the COVID-19 crisis. And if we're lucky and we have time, we're going to get into some other topics on corruption. And we have a few more saved in our back pocket, but I'll wait and see where we get to today, because of course we're going to want to get to your questions towards the end during an active Q&A session. So first, I'll go ahead and get started. When it comes to scams and frauds, there are countless ones right now. Whatever regulatory agency, whatever law enforcement agency, Interpol, whoever's reports that I've been reading and their news updates, there are literally thousands out there. This is a time for exploitation of fears and opportunity for criminals to make money easily and quickly, because we're in a vulnerable position. First off, numerous phishing attacks, emails, texts, and so on. And whether it's trying to get you to click on links, enter in personal information. The other thing is even through social media, please be careful. There's a lot of links, videos, and photos, even things like the COVID stats that came out right as soon as the pandemic started and were, had viruses in them and malware in them. So you have to be careful on what you're clicking. If just like in regular times, if it's not a known or a trusted source, please don't click on it. Like I say, videos, links, photos, and so on. The COVID stats, like I said, were fake. There's also some in various countries. I've had a lot of friends send me samples of their texts where they've been getting texts or emails from fake government officials offering financial assistance programs. And of course, a lot of people are in a position of financial fear and vulnerability right now. So people will click on it, enter their personal information, thinking that they've applied for some type of a grant or financial assistance. As well as financial institutions. I've had warnings from my financial institutions saying that people have been purporting to be them, sending out requests for information or links and so on. They're hoping people are going to click on. So again, exercise caution. I'm sure you've seen a lot. And then in terms of fakes, again, so many to talk about. Fake masks, fake sanitizers, fake medicines, fake claims for cures, fake vaccines. And one of the best ones I saw last night was in the UK, where, of course, we're moving, we're trying to move swiftly. We're moving with haste. Everybody's nervous, trying to do the right thing. So in terms of transporting some of these goods, criminals had planted £1 million worth of cocaine inside shipments of masks, hoping that they would clear customs and borders and so on quickly, trying to get to its ultimate destination to help people. And inside, tucked in, was some nice packages of cocaine inside. So make no mistake that for criminals and especially large organized crime groups, as soon as this started, they were rubbing their hands together and saying, what can we plot? What can we do? Where are our opportunities? Where can we exploit this and use it to our advantage? Okay, so we have to stay aware. We have to stay alert. There have been situations of fake family members reaching out for medical assistance or financial assistance to say they're having difficult times. And of course, that's pretty hard for people to resist. I even have someone I know who sent me a whaling CEO fraud example, where again, people might not be in the office pretending to be the CEO, sending out an urgent message to a staff member asking them to go ahead and process this payment. And thankfully, this is a firm, the people weren't too smart. They picked a firm that are experts in financial crime. So they saw the scam coming right away, but unfortunately, not everyone is going to. And some people are going to be in a position of being, nervous or vulnerable and distracted more so than usual, and may end up paying it with haste. There have been calls and visits, even in-person visits from people pretending to be government officials going door to door, trying to steal personal information and be able to commit ID theft. Now, this next one, you have to listen to this next one. Honestly, I saw this and I just shook my head. And as much as, I often work in these areas, this one, honestly, it just really hit me in the heart. I just found it so utterly disgusting, to be honest. This was in Louisville in the US. These criminals set up a fake COVID testing drive-through site. Now imagine, people are scared. They want to know if they have it. They're willing to pay the money to get tested. They're putting themselves at risk by leaving the house and going out and going through this drive-through. And this group of criminals, they had tents set up. They had on medical, protective equipment, sort of like equivalent of hazmat suits. They had a whole drive-through organized, people going through, taking payments, administering some kind of test. But at the end of the day, it was fake. It was just for a cash grab. And I just think that's so unbelievably horrible and exploiting the lowest of the lows. Now, another one, and there's been a lot of press on this as well, are things like fake investments, fake investment schemes, and so on, because the stock market took a massive hit. And people were trying to decide what to do with their investments, with their savings. Should they shift it? Should they move it? What should they do? And if in that moment, when somebody is worried about their nest egg and they're approached by fraudsters with, if they've put together a really nice looking plan and very professional and some great promises, someone might have found themselves vulnerable and susceptible to that and said, boy, that's a good idea. I need to move my money to where it is safe. And you have to be very careful. And especially if something is too good to be true, or if you don't know the source, you have to do your due diligence just as much as we do due diligence on our customers. And then, get this, last night, 8 o'clock, I got an email. Gold, time for you to move all your savings and invest it in gold. Click here, download my brochure, get more information where I can help you invest your money in gold. And I thought, oh my goodness, there we go. As I'm preparing for this webinar, I'm getting, this kind of scam attack. So anyways, I just wanted to say that as a bit of an opener to set the stage for today. And now I'm going to ask Carrie to talk to us about sanctions, because there are things that we need to consider at this time right now, how sanctions are affected. Are there any changes? Are there any loosenings and relaxing? Carrie is a foremost expert in sanctions, so we look forward to hearing from you, Carrie.
Thank you, and it's been a fascinating couple of weeks from a financial crimes, anti-money laundering perspective, both enlightening in the sense that there's been a lot of heroes doing the right thing, but also disheartening in the sense that you've already pointed out that the criminals are operating in full force. Along those lines, the Treasury Department, the U.S. government, has gone virtual. And so what we're seeing from them is, in these challenging times, full force activity. In the sanctions space in particular, of course, we've had the focus on the anti-money laundering and the corruption coming out of Venezuela. But specific to the COVID-19 reactions, there has been a bit of a media war between the government of Iran and the United States, Russia and China over whether the United States should be doing more with respect to reducing sanctions on Iran. And it's been really interesting because those of us in the sanctions world know that since 2000, the United States has had explicit licensing provisions that allow for medicine, medical devices, and agricultural commodities to go to Iran under certain conditions. And essentially those conditions are that the parties do their due diligence and make sure that the end users are not prohibited parties or engaged in illicit activity. So it's a clear supply chain, which is, something that we're all familiar with, supply chain transparency. The other things that the U.S. government has specifically done with respect to medical devices and medicine going to Iran is made sure that the Swiss banking channel is open. As far as has been publicized, there's only been one or two instances where companies have actually taken advantage of the Swiss banking channels. But if a company really truly wants to donate medicine or medical devices to Iran and they're not worried about the financial channels, certainly those avenues remain open. And it's been explicitly clear, both from statements from the president, from the secretaries of state and treasury, that if people in the United States or non-U.S. persons want to donate medicine or medical devices to specifically address need in Iran, of course, the channels remain open. With respect to the claims from the leadership in Iran that the United States is either hampering or discouraging donations, the U.S. government responded on March 17th with a very expansive fact sheet published from the virtual U.S. Embassy in Iran website. And it's interesting because it goes through and outlines the money laundering and the corruption risks that the U.S. government sees with respect to Iran in particular. It also specifically addresses the COVID issues and points out, again, this is from the U.S. government's perspective, that the government of Iran has actually been engaged in a campaign to discourage media reports with respect to COVID health issues, has encouraged flights to continue initially at least, between Tehran and Beijing. Uzmahan Air had continued to fly regularly. And it also talks about the allegations that the government of Iran over the last couple of years has actually been skimming money that was specifically supposed to go for medical relief work in Iran. The allegation is that some of that money, in the tune of billions, has ended up in a hedge fund that's actually run and managed by the supreme leader. So Pompeo's statements, both through this fact sheet, but also off of his Twitter account, has been that the United States remains committed to providing humanitarian support to the people of Iran, but that the people of Iran and the rest of the world should really be aware that the corruption within the Iranian regime is largely to blame for the reasons why the crisis in Iran for the people, including in the prisons now, is as bad as it is. So we expect that the media campaign between Iran and the U.S., both accusing the other of inappropriate activity, will continue. But what's interesting to note is for our clients, both European and U.S., donating into Iran, they've been doing so fairly freely since 2000 without much issue. So from our perspective, we do continue to see donations going in for the Iranian people. Sometimes the supply chains are stopped, and it's not always clear that the products are ending up where they're supposed to be. But that would be the one sanctions implication we're seeing. On the North Korea side, we're also seeing some really interesting activity from the U.S. government. Yesterday, a number of U.S. government agencies came out with what they're calling the DPRK Cyber Threat Advisory. And this is a fairly comprehensive document that goes through all of the financial crimes, money laundering, cybersecurity attacks that the North Korean government has been engaged in over the last decade. It's an interesting read, particularly for those in the anti-money laundering space, because it's clear that the North Korean government, according to this threat advisory, continues to specifically target the financial sector with a focus on digital currency exchanges, money services businesses, and also the media businesses themselves. So a lot of the warnings in the North Korea threat advisory that was published yesterday are what Glenna was talking about already, which is look for malware, look for email addresses or for website addresses that are .org instead of .com. Look for attempts to engage in other types of activity like comprehensive abuse of the ATM system so that the money can all be withdrawn automatically, across the world. The general gist coming out of the threat advisory is that in order to address the threat posed by the North Korean government, it's really one where the financial institutions and the global governments must cooperate and work together, just given the sophistication of the cybersecurity threats. Then the other specific examples that might be of interest to our audience today are the North Korean government's continued focus on ransom for information contained on the internet and for customers. What we're seeing also is that they've now evolved from just instead of requesting a one-time ransom payment, they've developed the system where they'll require monthly or long-term security contracts so that you would continue to make payments to the North Korean government or its proxies in order to guarantee that your company is not hacked again and the information is not held specifically up for ransom. The other new concept that was addressed in yesterday's briefing was this concept of cryptojacking, which is essentially using a machine in order to hijacking a machine or a computer system of a company in order to use it for North Korea's digital currency mining operations as well. So not specifically related to COVID, although given the patterns of illicit activity that we've seen before in the sanctions space, where there's an opportunity to make money, especially access to foreign currency, the rogue terrorist regimes like North Korea and Iran, which are both remain state sponsors of terrorism, will continue to exploit these types of opportunities in order to gain access to the international financial system.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Carrie. Yeah, lots to consider, and something that brought to mind when you were talking about sort of the hacking and the ransomware is I've heard of attempts on medical facilities, and you can only imagine how overrun medical facilities are right now. And then to face something like that where they wouldn't have access to their systems and records and so on, it's just, I just can't imagine what people would experience when that happens. Thank you. So now we're gonna, I would certainly suggest, if you haven't already, get your pen and paper ready, because we're gonna be talking about managing your compliance programs during this pandemic crisis. If your program is substantially paper-based, requiring you to be in the office, you're probably realizing that you're in a bit of trouble. So it's time to put a plan together, think about how you're gonna approach the board, how you need to upgrade your program, where you need to use automation. In terms of automation, there's a couple of terrific opportunities up there, both in terms of managing your compliance program and your due diligence records, as well as screening for sanctions that Carrie just talked about, and terrorists and so on. There's some really great automation tools out there. I highly suggest that you start exploring them. So Chanel is going to take us through several important elements for you to think about, especially during this time right now, where you need to factor those in. And then I'd say from an international and a domestic level, please be aware of the fact that there's a number of advisories, guidance papers, and so on that have come out. So first and foremost is the FATF. They released a paper on what you may consider and what you might think about doing in terms of risk-based approach, in terms of maybe applying more reduced diligence cases, in terms of onboarding and exploring some digital methods to do so that we wouldn't normally do in normal times, but of course, managing the risks, but still allowing the continuation of business. So Melissa has posted the link for the FATF document on that. And then the US, FinCEN has some advisory. The UK has an advisory out on what you might do about onboarding and managing your compliance risks. The Isle of Man does, Trinidad does. So watch out both internationally and as well as domestically. And Chanel, please take it from here.
Thank you, Glenna. I do agree that, as we all moved to working remotely over the past few weeks, we've encountered quite a bit of challenges. And, we have kids working, we're helping our kids, with their online schooling. We're trying to balance, our compliance programs, and, we're trying to be wives and husbands, cooking, cleaning, and doing all of that. But in order for us to maintain our compliance programs remotely, one of the most important things that we need to consider is being able to effectively communicate. So effective communication and ensuring that our means of communications are secure are one of the first and foremost things that we need to think about as we move remotely. Oftentimes when we're in an office environment and we have, we can just walk across the desk to one of our colleagues, we're no longer in that environment. So we need to ensure that the chains of commands are clearly identified and communicated to the members of the team, so that persons know who to go to at any point during their daily work. In addition to that, they want to ensure that we're not using systems. For example, one of the reports that recently came out was using the platform Zoom, where persons are actually hacking into your conference call and Zoom bombing. And we're in a field that we're continuously conversing and having secure conversations, and it's important that we use systems that have some level of multi-factor security built in. And if we don't have IT security policies that were built in to our systems before now, it's important for us to ensure that we get that going pretty quickly, because as Glenna mentioned before, the hackers and the financial criminals are not sleeping, and they're trying to find any means possible to get into our systems, get our information, whether that means selling it on the black market or whatever it is. So effective and secure communication is one of the first things that we need to ensure that we have down pat. One of the other things, now you just mentioned, the UK and a number of, other guidance documents that's out there, but regulatory technology is something that we've been hearing quite a bit about over the last 3 or 4 years. And I have some clients who, over the years have not really embraced the idea of going paperless, embraced the idea of regulatory technology. And in these recent times, they've, pretty much came to the table running, what solutions are out there? What do we have? What can we do? What does it cost? But regulatory technology is being embraced not only by individuals, but by regulators. The FATF on, I believe, April 1st, sorry, they pretty much said that, in light of social distancing, we should be considering, our verification processes remotely. So there are a number of systems out there, artificial intelligence they're using to, scan passports and tell you if it's a fraudulent passport. They're regulators that's accepting or stating. I know the UK was one that talked about taking selfies, having your clients take selfies or videos, or but at the end of the day, you have to look at your systems and determine what your risk-based approach would be as it relates to the onboarding of your clients. And we could there's smaller firms that can't necessarily afford to, purchase one of the state-of-the-art artificial intelligence systems, but there are means of, for example, as I mentioned before, the taking selfies and so forth. And once we, take on those mechanisms, taken in light or risk-based approach, it's important for us to document. Working remotely, document. Your chief compliance officer might be working, in a different time zone or whatever the case may be. So whatever you do along the way, it's important for you to document, because at the end of this, and I hope that there's a end to it very soon. At the end of this, we're going to have to answer to our regulators, and they're going to be looking to see what we have done during this time to ensure that our systems of quality controls were not infiltrated. We maintained a high level of compliance during this time. So if you have a client and you took them on, let's say this client was a new client, trust and corporate services provider, you're taking on a new client and you find that that client, their source of wealth, you have to dig deep to, and they're like, okay, well, I sold 1,000 masks or 1,000,000 masks to a company in the United States, and this is the source of funds. Then you need to, use your risk-based approach to determine the level of due diligence that you need to consider before taking on that client. So healthy skepticism as you go about your onboarding process, and just ensuring that your systems remain robust. As it relates to ensuring that your corporate governance regime is continuously robust, it's important for us to ensure that we are communicating with our senior managers and board of directors just as we do in office. So your weekly reports that you would usually send to your senior managers and board on the health of the compliance program, you want to ensure that you're still doing that remotely, whether it's weekly, a monthly report. And we also want to ensure that as we talk about reporting, we are satisfying our statutory obligations that the regulator have. So if our compliance officer reports are due on a annual basis, it's due in March, we want to ensure that we are still satisfying those requirements. Many regulators around the world are offering remote solutions. They're allowing you to, send your reports and make your suspicious activity reports electronically. So it's important as you communicate and as you build your communication means around your program, you pull out all the email address of all the relevant persons that you need from the regulatory side and ensure that your deadlines are being met. I mentioned risk-based approach quite a few times as I spoke, and it's very, very important for us to ensure that we're taking a risk-based approach to compliance as we work remotely. the FATF, their recommendation one since 2012 when they updated their methodology, spoke to risk-based approach. We've been hearing about it time and time again, but now more than ever, as compliance professionals working in this remote environment, we cannot stick to the checkbox approach to compliance. So if you were still in that phase of checking the box, okay, I have the passport, I have this, we have to move away from that phase and stay away from that phase as we move on from the pandemic, because that's the only way our systems would survive. If you have a client right now and you're asking them to check all these boxes in the midst of this pandemic, not only would your board of directors call you anti-money, but you're also not working with the business to ensure that there's continuation on the business side, as well as securing the possibility of financial criminals impeding and getting into your systems. The last thing that I would talk about is training. Earlier this week, I had a client and they reached out to me, and they were pretty much saying that, we're looking for training for our team. This isn't specific to compliance, but they were looking for soft skill training. And they sent me a particular link to a platform. And the reality is that the platform offered them one free training, and I think the next 5 topics were at a very, very discounted price. But before they got the free training, they were required to put in their credit card information. This is something that we need to really, really look out for. We are working from home. We might have a bit more time. We're not commuting, so we don't have to think about a 30 or 1-hour drive to the office. So we might have some more time to train and develop, which I really, really encourage. But we need to ensure that we're looking for credible sources. Cheap is not always the answer. So credible sources, credible persons. They have a website. You could pick up the phone and probably give them a call just to see what their program offer. Just have that initial conversation. Just like we do due diligence and KYC on our clients, we need to ensure that we're doing KYC on the vendors and the persons that we're doing business with in these times. All right.
Thanks, Chanel. You gave us so much to think about. And if there's a couple that I'm going to sort of grab my yellow highlighter and go over, is definitely the risk-based approach, and document what you're doing right now with regards to that. Everyone that's on this call today and attending, all of our businesses have different sizes, complexities, nature of business. So it has to be what's going to suit our company's risks. Document what you're doing that is different during this time. Memos to file, compliance officer has to sign off, or whoever in your AML policy it says can approve exceptions. Make sure you're following whatever that exception approval process is and document it. But just similarly to how boards right now might be having their AGMs or their board meetings remotely, and perhaps it could be that the governance documents required for them to have it in person normally. They're going to have to document that during this pandemic, we held the meeting remotely, and so on. So again, document, document, document. And I have seen fake invitations to conferences and training asking for your credit card information. I've had clients and friends contact me to say, hey, Glenna, are you going to this? And I'm like, that looks like a scam. Don't touch it. Don't go for it. Leave it alone. Melissa, let me pause for a second. Did you want us to go ahead and do a poll question, or should I continue on with the next topic?
Let's give it 30 seconds. We'll try again. I know a lot of folks had some issues with the technology, so I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll right now, and we'll give it 30 seconds to see if everyone's able to respond this time around. And if not, we'll just continue.
Okay, perfect.
You should be seeing it on your screen. You can go ahead and select the answer. So we're getting a lot more responses in. Are you seeing the responses there, Glenna?
No, I'm seeing the question.
Oh, okay. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the responses. So we're looking at about 57% that are in fact finding it harder during the pandemic to manage their compliance program, many cases, of course, remotely.
Great.
I'm going to go
Thanks,
ahead and put
Melissa.
you back on the screen. Yep.
Well, that shows me that there can be work to be done, but I'm also really pleased to see the 43% that said no, because that means you probably have been moving towards remote efforts, electronic storage of information, maybe even software programs you're using. So great, you're on the right track. And hopefully you're sharing that with your colleagues in the industry so they can improve their compliance programs as well. Let's talk about transaction monitoring for a moment, because during this time, there are changes. If you're a financial institution that manages financial transactions and you have not made any adjustments to your alerts or however you conduct your financial transaction monitoring, it's time to do so, because things have changed. So first off, Chanel touched on it, you might see increases in cash flow from businesses that are involved in the sale of masks, other medical equipment, sanitizers, ventilators, and so on. Figure out if those are already existing legitimate businesses and this is just an increase in their revenues, or were they set up just for this purpose? And it's possible that there were no masks that were sold and they're just pretending to have that additional cash flow that might have come in the back door from their drug sales. But I think what's even more important for us to watch for right now is what hasn't changed. Which of our customers and our businesses have not had a drop in their financial activity when they absolutely should have? So a lot of our jurisdictions, I appreciate we're all from different jurisdictions, a lot of our jurisdictions have different, curfews, lockdowns, and so on. There are certain types of retail shops, and for instance, in Barbados, as an example, that are now allowed to be open. Okay, they have to be closed, only essential services. If those businesses are still continuing to do deposits or cash transactions or financial transactions to the same tune that they were doing before, we have a problem. And in terms of good opportunities to both launder money and then some other nefarious business, think about some cash intensive businesses that your customers might be involved in, okay? So think about the restaurants and the bars, and again, certain jurisdictions, those have to be closed, or some restaurants are allowed to do takeout activity. So monitor to see if it makes sense. Have they had a change as they should in their financial activity? Because those cash intensive businesses we know can often be exploited for money laundering purposes. And then even more importantly and more interestingly is look at massage parlors and nail salons. We're supposed to be social distancing. We're not supposed to be touching. We shouldn't be getting a massage. We shouldn't be getting our nails done. If those businesses still have a healthy amount of financial activity, hint, hint, take a look, we might have a problem, Houston, okay? So dig in, because the non-essential businesses for the most part should not be operating, so go ahead and have a look at that. Now, Chanel, I'm gonna ask you, you had mentioned a couple as well to do with corporate and trust service providers as well as insurance companies, if you wanna add those.
Right. I touched on the one for trust and corporate services providers, and it would be relevant to banks as well, where they see, they have those transactions where, like the mass example where, you need to dig deeper into the source of funds to understand, where the funds are coming from or why the person wants to set up a particular company at this time. As it relates to the healthcare providers, like insurance companies, for example, we want to ensure that healthcare fraud or an increase in claims as it relates to healthcare. So you would have, small clinics and so forth is sending in claims for false insurance. They haven't seen 50 clients as it relates to COVID-19, but you receive an increase in claims, an increase in ambulance rides and so forth. So those are some areas that we want to look at, especially for insurance providers.
Mm-hmm. A point that I forgot to mention, when I was mentioning the cash intensive businesses and specifically nail salons and massage parlors, yes, we should be social distancing, no touching. If there's still financial transaction, not only can it be financial crime, it could also be a sign of human trafficking. Mm-hmm. Those businesses might be earning revenue right now through some other illegal activity where they're exploiting the workers and they're not really doing the work that they've set out on their incorporation documents, you know what I mean? So now, let's talk about terrorism for a moment. And Carrie, I'm going to ask you to expand on this section. The reality is terrorist organizations need money all the time. On a constant basis, they're looking at fundraising opportunities and activities. They're trying to generate funds so that they can source the equipment, people, and whatnot, expertise that they need to successfully run their terrorist organizations. But Carrie, let me let you expand on that, and that especially if you can mention Secretary Pompeo's comment about Iran as well.
Sure. So the terrorism sector is really fascinating because it seems like we see an uptick in charitable activity every single time there's a natural disaster. And oftentimes what happens is it's playing on the good-natured hearts of donors. So the charitable sector in particular is high risk at this point, as it typically is in any time, just given that charities tend to donate monies and to operate in high-risk jurisdictions. So given COVID-19, what we're seeing now is that the charity sector is even higher risk for exploitation by terrorist financiers and terrorist financing, specifically because people are at home and are feeling helpless and are wanting to donate and to do the right things. So the guidance that we are providing is the same guidance we were providing right after September 11th in 2001, which is if you're going to donate money to a charitable entity or an enterprise, do your due diligence. Make sure that the money that you're providing is really going to a legitimate charity. There's various ways of checking that. There's in the United States, there's ratings and guidelines for charities. You can confirm their 501c3 status, but even if that's not good enough, the pattern that we saw after 9/11 was that, particularly with respect to the Muslim community, and it's the same in the Christian community, where there's this concept of tithing or providing a certain percentage of your income to these religious entities. What we were seeing after 9/11 and what we're starting to see now is that the charities are playing on the heartstrings of donors to say, provide money to these, and then we will we will make these donations. The bottom line is that money is fungible. So if you're providing money to a charity, do it through the big regulated ones that are well known. The Red Cross, the Red Crescent. Those are legitimate organizations. There's thousands of other ones that are also legitimate. But if you're getting notices that are unsolicited, for example, Glenn has mentioned the text, then maybe that's not the organization you want to donate your money or your resources to. And largely that's because the terrorists are using this opportunity, as they do in any international crisis, in order to access additional funding. So the guidance that we've seen with respect to Pompeo's statements on Iran, we've seen it with respect to the North Korea guidance. And then obviously the Department of the Treasury has these charities guidelines that have been published for a long time. And they go through a lot of what both you, Glenna, and Chanel were saying, which is, even though we're in a time of crisis, the bottom line is you have to fall back on your due diligence policies and procedures. So if you're a donor and you want to give money to a charity or to a charitable sector, make sure that the end party is in fact who you want it to be and is not just a spoofing entity. I thought that the Interpol announcement yesterday was particularly fascinating. It's not in the terrorism sector, but it's a fantastic example of pretty much everything we've been talking about today. And what Interpol reported was a cross-European criminal enterprise where by the German government had gone onto a website that they thought was legitimate and thought was tied to a Spanish company in order to buy a number of masks. The company had a website that looked like a Spanish website. When the German officials contacted the parties through the website, they unfortunately compromised their emails. And so a dialogue started between the bad guys and the German officials, in the sense that what ended up happening was they placed an order for a significant number of masks. The original party then said, oh, we no longer have the masks, but we have a trusted party in the Netherlands who can hook you up with another supplier. At that point, the German government made an initial payment in advance in order to secure the delivery of the masks. right before delivery was due, the supplier of the masks said that they had not received the initial deposit and requested an additional 800,000 euro to be provided, which of course at that point the wheel started to turn and the financial institutions and Interpol got involved. And what ended up happening was this fascinating flow of funds. So the money went from the German government to went from the German government to the Dutch company, to a German company, to a United Kingdom entity, and then to a Nigerian bank account. And what ended up happening was eventually the money was able to all be returned to its appropriate sourcing. But what was fascinating is that because of the urgency to acquire the mask, the purchaser in this case did a number of things that we've talked about that was inappropriate. First, they didn't verify that the supplier was in fact a legitimate business. It was like a .org instead of a .com. Second, the offer for the goods was really too good to be true. And then the third issue that we typically wouldn't do under normal circumstances is make a cash in advance payment for goods where you have an unverified supplier. So I think that the lesson from the Interpol announcement yesterday, and then also the corresponding guidance coming out of Interpol with respect to all of the COVID fraud, also specifically covering the charity sector, is really worth looking at, which is, as Chanel was saying, and as Glenna as well, if you have policies and procedures, obviously we need to amend them. But when it comes to knowing who your customer is and doing the due diligence, it's still an important part of protecting the financial integrity of your business, because whether it's a charity or whether it's the Nigerian scammers in this particular case, the desire is to make a lot of money very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to put in
example.
with some questions from the audience right now, if you'll let me
Sure.
redirect a little bit, Glenna. Carrie, I have a few questions for you specifically, but first I've gotten a few remarks. You had mentioned a cybersecurity report on North Korea, and if you could just repeat the name of that report and where people can access that online.
We can circulate it after, but it's called the DPRK Cyber Threat Advisory, and it was published by a number of U.S. government agencies yesterday, including the Department of the Treasury. So it's on Treasury's website, and then there's a separate there's the one that the Department of Treasury, Homeland Security, and the FBI published, but there's a separate one also coming from the Department of Energy. So we can provide links, but essentially you can find it on the Department of the Treasury's website. It's a fairly lengthy document, and it has some very helpful tips.
Okay. Another question that I've gotten a few times is regarding countries receiving aid from sanctioned countries. How does this translate into risk for the region, and what particularly does our audience need to look out for regarding that?
Right. So the one example we see every single time there's a health issue is the use of Cuban doctors. We saw it under the Ebola crisis, and we're seeing it now where the Cuban government is offering its doctors up for various jurisdictions to help. From a U.S. perspective, that's problematic, essentially because the way that this typically works is where it's volunteer work, it's one thing, but typically there's an arrangement where the Cuban government is being paid for offering up its doctors and nurses for the services, and the money, of course, isn't going to the doctors and nurses; it's going to the Cuban government. So where that tends to implicate other businesses is in the insurance space. So you'll get requests for travel or health cover for the Cuban doctors and nurses, or you'll see U.S. dollar payments going through the international financial system. And obviously, if it's a Cuban government party on the other end, from a U.S. perspective, it's still prohibited unless there's a specific license. And in some cases, it's very possible that the party will have obtained authorization from Treasury to deal in U.S. dollars.
A lot of people have found the discussion around technology, Chanel, to be quite important right now, and they want to go a little bit deeper. So could you just give us a little more about electronic ID verification regarding the onboarding process, and then what do you consider that businesses need to do right now so that the customers don't become accustomed to perhaps a stopgap measure becoming permanent? If you could comment on that a little bit, Chanel.
Well, as I mentioned when I was speaking, there are quite a number of systems out there, and what the systems allow you to do is, for example, in the past, we would request, let's say, a passport. We would require it to be certified, signed by a notary in a particular jurisdiction with prescribed language, put in the mail, sent to us so that we have a wet ink certified copy of that document. What the electronic systems allows for, some of them use artificial intelligence to determine whether or not, so they look at the facial recognition of the individual, they look at the passport, does the passport numbers match, so there are a number of algorithms. Every system is different in how they, verify the ID document. But most of them use artificial intelligence. What was the next part of the question, Melissa? Melissa, are you there?
I apologize, I was on mute.
No.
Yes, that some of these, that while companies may be putting stopgap measures into place, there is concern that the customers would get used to those processes, and so they want to know how that can be best managed.
To be quite honest, and this is my opinion, not legal advice, I don't think that we should go back, to be quite honest. I think we should continue to press forward. The BVI, for example, which is my home jurisdiction in 2018, and I think we learned a lot as it relates to working remotely coming out of Hurricanes Irma and Maria, made some amendments to our AML code, which allowed for electronic verification. So you would already see in our jurisdiction a lot of licensees already using regulatory technology to effect customer due diligence. So I think that the reality is that the world is going digital, and if we could find effective and secure means of effecting customer due diligence, I don't think that we need to get to that place now where starting to look more at regulatory technology and then go back to, okay, well, I accepted a selfie or I did X, Y, and Z at this point, and we need to go back now to you sending me tons and tons of mail with hard copy. And I mean, not all jurisdictions accept electronic verification, but I think especially with this crisis, more and more persons are again looking at taking a risk-based approach, and I really don't see things going back to what they used to be.
Yeah, and if I can add to that as well, there's a really good guidance document that came out from the FATF in the last 2 months called Digital Identity. It gives really interesting information, so for both countries as well as entities to consider what they can do in terms of adopting these new measures. I agree with Chanel. I don't think we need to go back. I hope we don't go back, and I think it's up to all of us to work with our local compliance associations, work with our regulators, to show them some of the guidance papers in case they're not aware of it, and ask for what alternatives can be put in place. But the reality is, in many cases, we do deal with our customers remotely anyways. It's a matter of convenience. Let's just find the proper, robust, safe, secure way to continue to manage the money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing risk.
We've had a few, yeah, we've had a few, I've had a few people ask regarding the case of the German government, which Carrie mentioned. Could you just go a little bit deeper into what specifically did they miss? What are those things that we need to be more attentive to right now that even in this case, the German government missed just because of trying to get this taken care of as quickly as possible?
Sure. And actually just because things are developing so quickly, people may want to know that Treasury literally just published a fact sheet on provision of humanitarian assistance and trade to combat COVID-19. It includes specific provisions relating to exports of PPE as well. So I'll just flag that for people. But going back to the Interpol notice from April 14th with respect to the German scheme, essentially what they said is that it was a series of mistakes relating to compromised emails. So this is what happened when the buyer reached out to this fake website. It was it looked like it was a Spanish business that is legitimate. The differences were slight. In the email and the website was like a .org instead of a .com. So verifying web addresses is very important, and then making sure that the website isn't just a spoof website is also something that we can take away from the Interpol action on April 14th. Essentially, what happened was the German government contracted with two companies, one in Zurich and one in Hamburg, to purchase the $15 million or 15 million euros worth of masks. They had done some basic due diligence. They thought the Spanish company that was related to all of this was legitimate, but if they had time and weren't offering a sort of emergency setting, they may have reached out to suppliers that are known suppliers rather than this other entity. The other warning coming out of the Interpol notice is that the email addresses on the website were different from the legitimate Spanish business's website, and that they should have been on alert that when the company originally said it was able to provide the 10 million masks, but then changed its tune and then started this pattern of referrals to other suppliers located throughout Europe. At that point, red flags should have been going up. And under normal circumstances, most people would realize that something was afoot. The other thing that they should have realized is when they started relying on the suppliers' recommendations to use another trusted supplier, this time a Dutch supplier, that now they were far from dealing with the Spanish company that they thought was legitimate. They were now relying on representations essentially from the bad guys with respect to, who a trusted supplier actually was. And then the final issues were the request for delivery of the goods after receipt of an initial down payment. So once the down payment was wired, and then they received notice from the supplier saying, oh, we actually didn't ever receive the supplier, we need additional money before we're going to consummate the delivery, then the German government should have been on notice that they've now made 2 wire payments and have no actual goods. Perhaps something was afoot. But luckily for this, because they were able to notify authorities quickly enough, the financial institutions also were notified quickly enough, all of the funds that had been moved through the system, so from the Netherlands, Germany, UK, Nigeria, the financial institutions were essentially able to back out of all of those transactions. So the other takeaway here is, if something seems like it's going wrong and that you've had an example where you've been taken advantage of, immediately reach out to your financial institution, but also reach out to the authorities, because it's still possible in some of these cases to be able to back out of the transactions.
Yeah, I think I'll add to that, Carrie, that in these desperate times, people are urgent to get the equipment. The supply chain and procurement processes and internal controls that would normally be followed were obviously shortcut. And then secondly, you would never send a large cash-based payment before having any guarantee for the supplies. Usually you'd be using some good trade finance tools through your financial institutions to better ensure that process. So again, exploiting the desperation, the urgency, and the vulnerability. I'd also say to everyone, if you want to consider connecting with any of us on LinkedIn. I know that Carrie, Chanel, and myself, we often publish these papers and post them on our LinkedIn pages for everyone to see in case everyone hasn't seen them yet. So you may do so. And I know after today's, in the next day or two, I'll try to post as much as what we talked about, and maybe Carrie can post that note from Interpol and so on and so forth.
Yes, Glenna, we've mentioned quite a few documents in this, and so I've gotten a lot of questions around that. So one of the things that we will do is we'll put that on the CRCA Facebook page as well. We'll put the links to all of those documents. Glenna, could you just go ahead and repeat that page for everyone, please?
Sure. It's the Facebook page is Caribbean Regional Compliance Association, and then a colon and conference. Okay. Caribbean Regional Compliance Association conference.
We are at the top of the hour, so we do need to start wrapping up. Glenna, I want to thank the ladies for being with us today, and I'll let you go ahead and close the webinar.
Well, thank you very much. I think there's so much we could talk about. We honestly could probably fill another hour or two, and I'm just going to close with, before I close, add one more thing. Corruption. We didn't get a chance to talk about corruption, but corruption, just like everything else, is going to be employed as a tactic and a tool to exploit vulnerable positions. So whether it's in contracts and so on, that, you know, again, corners might be cut. But an interesting one that I saw recently, I think just a week ago, is the mafia in Italy is sort of using their powers of persuasion, shall we say, where they are providing essential supplies to people in various towns where they know they're desperate for goods, and in return, there's an expectation of gaining their loyalty. So they're offering a bribe effectively with, you know, essential goods, food, hygiene supplies, and so on, with an expectation of commitment and loyalty, if not, you know, little payments thereafter. So a lot to think about and consider. This was meant to be an information session to get you thinking. Make sure that you have considered that you still need to manage all of your compliance, money laundering, terrorism financing, proliferation financing risks. However, the methods that you might employ may be different, and where you've made any differentiation to policy, document that. Think about maintaining your good governance. There's a lot that we've talked about. Again, follow us on LinkedIn, follow the CRCA on Facebook, and we'll do our best to keep you informed. Stay alert, and please be safe and enjoy that long commute to your living room.